Hello and welcome back. Thanks to those of you who are following this channel, so I really appreciate it. And anyone who's come across this, please do subscribe and like these videos if you enjoy them. Share them, let people know, because there's a lot of them. There'll be a lot more to come. And just have a look at the alternative section that I've gone through. I've pulled out a couple of bands or musicians that I'm focusing in on. And previously I looked at Radiohead because I had quite a few Radiohead albums. But of course within alternative indie they did warrant some attention, and the same goes for this band, which you may have guessed by now, also in the R's, a prominent alternative indie band being R.E.M. So this is the earliest album that I have. I do like the sound of Reckoning, which I don't have. I'm not that interested in Murmur, which I believe is their first album. So this is from the late 80s, 1987. This is actually a re-release. It's got a few extra tracks on it. So that's always good to go back sometimes and grab something retrospectively, because rather than get the original album way back in the late 80s, early 90s, getting it maybe in the 2000s, they've done these sort of reissues where they've added a bit more content. This album is really good. It's quite political. And R.E.M. are sort of one of those quintessential alternative bands. They did sit outside mainstream music. They represented college radio, I guess, in terms of an aesthetic, a style of musicianship. You know, I've used that phrase garage band a little bit too much here and there. At least I've moved away from saying Americana. But it's, I mean, there's accomplishment to the playing, so it's definitely, you know, it's not like it's rough and ready, but it's politically driven. It's more about the lyrics. This is almost like a conceptual album in some respects, because there's a lot of, it opens with something called Finest Work Song, and then of course a few tracks in you get Exhuming McCarthy, which obviously is talking about McCarthyism from the 50s. And then further on you get It's the End of the World as We Know It and I Feel Fine, which is a big hit. So check that one out. It's the End of the World as We Know It. So there's sort of a call to action, but at the same time resigning oneself to, you know, the human condition and what people are doing to the planet and what people do politically. So, you know, as the name suggests, document is sort of putting people on notice. And of course that doesn't really cross over to the mainstream terribly well in terms of popularity. I mean, many of the songs are quite upbeat, quite interesting in terms of how they've put them together, but it was really something that got played on, like I said, college radio is shorthand for saying it was sort of below the radar. Then they came out with Green. Now, I'm not sure what, maybe there was something between Document and Green, but I'm just going through the albums that I have. And Green I really, really like. I love that sticker too up here. This again is still the late 80s. So 89, 88 or 89. I'm trying to check that. You know, I try and do this in real time. 88, I think. Don't hold me to that. But of course, this one again, quite political. It talks about one's called World Leader Pretend is one of the tracks. Orange Crush is a standout track from here and did get some airplay a little bit beyond college radio. They started sort of breaking out a little more into the mainstream. Orange Crush being about Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. So again, highly political. Green, obviously, there's environmental concerns. I guess I should show the back too. Doesn't hurt to turn things around, so that's, you know, like a tree's rings kind of motif there. And Pop Song 89 is the opening track, and that was quite popular. So check out Green as a sort of, I guess, the momentum of moving away from the IRS years. So that first album, Document, and then Murmur and Reckoning, and there might have been some others, but I know that Murmur, Reckoning, and Document are sort of considered their three sort of quintessential early albums on the IRS label. But then they obviously moved to a new label. I'm not going to go into that, but they started becoming, I don't want to say poppy, they just started making tracks that had some cut through. Now, the next one I've got is Automatic for the People, but at some point they had an album, Out of Time. It may have been before this or after this. And on Out of Time was Losing My Religion, so that was a big hit for them. And then off this album, they had Everybody Hurts, which is a very sentimental song, got overplayed, addressing suicide, so, you know, a tough topic, And I think a lot of people, it did resonate with a lot of people. So Automatic for the People really had some cut through, and there's some really good tracks on here like Man on the Moon. I really like Night Swimming. I like Drive. The Sidewinder Sleeps Tonight. There's a lot of good tracks on this. So I mean, maybe if you were to investigate having one R.E.M album, this could be it. But I would recommend looking at Document. In fact, I haven't got too many, but I think I've got a good snapshot of their trajectory. So following up from Automatic for the People, for me anyway, I'm not sure what albums come between, because they were reasonably prolific, but there's Monster, and this is still very late. Let me have a look. Oh no, it's sort of early 90s now, 94, so they've crossed into the 90s. In fact, this album, What's the Frequency, Kenneth, got a lot of attention. That's the opening track. And then they also have... let me have a look. Let Me In was a really heartfelt track because it was Michael Stipe, the lead singer of R.E.M, addressing the suicide of Kurt Cobain. So I went and saw them when they were touring on this album, Monster, and Let Me In was quite a profound track in that moment because Kurt Cobain had recently taken his own life. So yeah, Monster is worth looking at. It's quite different. It's very... I guess guitar pedal driven reverb and distortion and feedback and stuff. So, and it's quite a loud album, I guess, in that respect. The other ones are a little bit more airy and guitar driven. All of them are quite guitar driven and lyric driven by Michael Stipe, but Monster really gets kind of dirgy and I guess it was off the back of the grunge era. It's got that sort of quality to it. And then the last album I've got, so that's just 4, and this is the 5th album I've got, which is New Adventures in Hi-Fi. And that was sort of a significant, it's one that Michael Stipe refers to as their best album, sort of the pinnacle for them. But this is sort of where I stopped buying R.E.M albums. And it's interesting because this is the first album they released after their record-breaking album deal. So off the back of Green and Automatic for the People and Out of Time and Monster, they were getting a lot of airplay. Suddenly they had crossed over and become very popular. So they were in mainstream radio at this point. They were being listened to, played on MTV by the general population. And of course, and I can just check it, it was Warner threw $80 million at them, which was the most that any band had had in terms of a record contract. And it was a 5-album, 5-year deal. And this is the first album that they released under that deal. And of course, it was not a commercial success. It's an interesting album. It talks about the West, how the West was won and where it got us. So again, political, but nothing poppy, nothing upbeat. There were a few upbeat tracks on Green and Out of Time, and even Automatic for the People sort of had some clean, clear resonances that caught people's attention. And then suddenly New Adventures in Hi-Fi, after this deal, I wouldn't say it tanked, but did not do as well as I'd imagine the executives at Warner would have liked. And then after that, they're fulfilling their obligation to the $80 million contract and releasing album after album. I'm not sure that's a really healthy way to go for a lot of bands, but bands do it. It's been superseded by the likes of Taylor Swift and Adele. I think there's been all sorts of bands that have since had bigger contract deals. But also famously, you have the likes of George Michael and Prince that got themselves caught up in those sorts of deals that then wanted to get out of them, because I don't think it's particularly constructive for, let's call them artists, I try and avoid that phrase, but for musicians and bands to be tied to deals where they have to be quite prolific to fulfill their contractual obligations. And of course, famously, Prince changed his name to a symbol to try and get around the contract. He also would write slave on the side of his face when he was sort of playing in concerts and maybe during interviews, during album releases that he was sort of compelled to do. So I think it does impinge upon creativity sometimes, having these massive deals and these commitments to these labels, major labels. So that's a good overview, I guess, of their output from late 80s right through to Now, when was this last? This was 96. So, I mean, they were still putting out albums right up till 2011. They even got a new contract. There goes a truck that you might hear in the background there. But even up to 2011, they were releasing albums, but they did retire around that time, I think, and that's it. But of course, they always toured, and that's how musicians make the money for themselves, less about the money that gets made for the labels through the sales of CDs. And of course, during the mid-90s, CD sales were at their peak. So obviously it seemed like a good deal for Warner to secure them and then get them to pump out albums after album. And they weren't all good, they weren't all bad, but I'm a fan, but I just didn't go down the rabbit hole of collecting every single R.E.M. album. I just appreciate that they are one of those alternative indie bands that really did set the scene for a lot of other bands to come after them. And then also they're a good example of a band that can cross over and become not just popular, but hugely popular. I guess you could think of U2 as being a bit like that. Way back in the day, in the 80s, they were a very political band, and their music wasn't entirely accessible until they got to something like Joshua Tree, and then Achtung Baby, and so on and so forth, and then it became a stadium act. I don't think R.E.M. was... they would have filled stadiums, that's true, and I saw them at a large venue, but they didn't quite cross over to that spectacle side of stadium bands that, say, U2 did. But it's interesting to know that alternative bands can very quickly become not pop bands, and I still yet to make a video about that sort of distinction between alternative and popular, because pop is a very particular sound, but they did become a popular rock band rather than just an alternative or independent band as they were first thought of. So that's it for R.E.M. I'm going to get straight into the S's next, and then there's going to be a couple of bands that might be plucked out of the S's to talk about individually. So please subscribe, come back, and see you soon. Thanks for watching.